My name is Rabbi Phil Bressler. We're at Beit Am in Corvallis, Oregon, and this is session 1 of Making Sense of the Siddur. And in today's session, we're going to go over a few pieces that are going to lay the groundwork for the rest of what we're going to learn about. Mainly the transition from Judaism as a temple-based sacrificial religion to Judaism, the religion centered around prayers, frequently in the synagogue context, but also individual prayer. The formation of the Siddur, that is the prayer book. And then also the way I'm going to introduce the way we're going to go about analyzing the Siddur through what's called prayer rubrics. So I want to tell you first a little bit about why I decided to teach this specifically, because it definitely comes from somewhat of a revelatory moment that I had. I see we have a participant online. Let's see who joined us. It's hard to say, but there I see 2 viewers. So if you've joined us online, make sure to say something in the chat so that I know you're here. So if you've been to services before, either here or anywhere else, you've probably gotten a sense that each service kind of has its own ambiance, right? Shabbat has kind of a tranquil joy. Festivals, there's a feeling of greater exuberance. Weekdays, which we actually do here in many synagogues, they don't necessarily. There's sort of a regularity, a familiarity to it. It's kind of the same old thing. But also, if you've come to like a Ma'ariv service, there's a sense of kind of need for comfort and redemption. But it can be really difficult to appreciate these themes and feel these feelings, which you are deliberately supposed to feel, without a sense of the baseline, right? A general scenario that expresses the sort of basic aspects of Jewish worship. The way you sort of recognize what's special and sort of receive the communication of what the people who put together the Siddur are trying to tell you is by noticing where they deviate from the norm. So if you don't kind of know what the norm is, it's impossible to know and appreciate that, right? Like if you're an appreciator of any kind of art form, you'll know what I'm talking about, right? And we'll get a little bit back into that later. But basically what I'm getting at is that there's sort of a basic arc of Jewish prayer. It starts with preparation for prayer, as you're probably familiar with, leading us gradually from the mundane towards sensing the presence of God, and through the use of biblical texts frequently that emphasize God's goodness, God's merciful nature, God's love for Israel, God's providence towards all humankind. And as we encounter more and more of these texts, the exuberance kind of increases. If you've ever been part of a Shabbat morning service, the way we do Psukei de Zimra, which we'll talk more about what exactly that is, but it starts with a lot of singing. And that's on purpose to kind of increase that feeling of exuberance. And praise is heaped on praise, and there's the rhythm and the repetition increase, helping to build this kind of mood of joyful expectation. And this whole experience leads us toward an act of blessing, in which we speak directly to God, and we experience God as the creator and the revealer and the lawgiver. But worship's not only prayer. We're human beings reaching out to God. It also includes listening. Through our recitation of crucial passages from Torah. I'm indicating here specifically things like Ve'ahavta, crucial passages of Torah. And we formally accept them as consequential to us, and we acknowledge God's role in the story of our past redemption. And it's only at that point that we're really ready to stand before God, contemplating and praising Him first, but then coming before God to petition and ask for stuff, basically. Here I'm talking about the Amidah, that central standing prayer. And we eventually leave God's presence, feeling a sense of peace and assurance. And we kind of conclude by acknowledging our belief and our loyalty and voicing our hope. Things almost always end on a note of hope for the future. So speaking from my own experience, I grew up in a Reformed community in Minneapolis, and I learned the liturgy of the prayer service primarily through repetition, like a lot of folks who grew up going to religious school, and also a little bit through study of the content of the liturgy. Like we would have bits of learning in religious school where we basically translate, or we go in detail through a piece of liturgy. In English, for example, we'd read Ve'ahavta by translating, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind." So, I knew what that meant. But it wasn't really until reaching rabbinical school and making more focus of the study of the liturgy more broadly that it made that I started to get a sense of kind of what's going on in a big picture way, and to have a sense at any given moment, like, what are we doing now? Where are we headed? Where are we come from? At any given point in the service. And I want to testify that the liturgy can be really confusing. There's a lot of it. And, even if you're reading it in English, as we only do occasionally, it can really seem like random, kind of chaotic, bits of text as opposed to a carefully constructed whole, which it definitely is, but it's really hard to appreciate that. So if you haven't appreciated it before, know that you're not alone. But prayer is really an art form. And like other arts, the first step to appreciating it is to appreciate the pattern that's at work within it. So that's our goal overall, is to appreciate the kind of overall bigger patterns within prayer. So we'll start with the kind of first section that I hinted at, which is the transition that Judaism as a religion underwent from a temple-centered religion to a tefillah, prayer-centered religion. And I'm going to hand a few texts out. Actually, that's something I intended to do too for anyone following along online. I'm going to share a link here in the chat that will let you see the texts that I'm going to be referencing. There we go. So you can go to that link and check it out. It's a source sheet on Safaria. And I'm just going to make reference to a couple of these as we go along. It's not exactly the primary text. So if you don't have it up in front of you, I don't think it's the end of the world. So basically, the institution of sacrifice, and by that I mean animal sacrifice primarily, but sacrifice of all kinds, was in the early, the sort of infancy of Israelite religion, was a nearly universal mode of human-God interaction in the ancient Near East more broadly. So when the Bible picks up on that, and animal sacrifice is obviously a big part of Israelite religion as presented in the Torah, they're really just working with material that they already have. That's already the sort of base level context. Like, everybody sacrificed their gods, whether it was sun gods or sky gods or rain gods or whatever it was. That was really the primary mode. But sacrifice in Israelite religion became divorced from prayer. And I'll talk about a bit what that means. But it's really important because then sacrifice and prayer were able to develop apart from one another. And it actually really has to do with the radical nature of religion, the religion of Israel. The concept of monotheism, basically, and the concept that there's only one divine power that exists, brought along with it the realization that our God, the God of Israel, has no need for physical sustenance, for example. A lot of other ancient Near Eastern religions saw their sacrifices literally feeding the gods, and this still in various pagan religions goes on. There's often an offering of some kind of food, which is framed as literally feeding the gods. But our God, since our God is the God of everything, has no need for physical sustenance, and so prayer already starts to diverge from. Sacrifice already starts to take a different track in Israelite religion than it did elsewhere. From the standpoint of the Bible, sacrifices are kind of like a favor granted us by God in order to permit us some kind of access, some kind of chance to feel close to God. They were a method of expressing human emotion. If you go and you read Vayikra, as one of our B'nai Mitzvah students this year is perhaps unfortunately going to have to do. She's going to read the first few chapters of Vayikra, where it lays out the different kinds of sacrifices. And they really correspond in a lot of ways to feelings that you might bring into a prayer context, feelings of guilt, feelings of repentance, of thanksgiving, of well-being. Those are all actually names for sacrifices, but if you think about that, they make sense as prayers too, right? And there's also the understanding very clearly within the Torah, but also developed more fully in the prophetic books, that just doing the act of sacrifice isn't a substitute for doing the right thing. Isaiah is pretty clear. Is this the fast I desire? Don't bring me, speaking in God's voice, don't bring me these sacrifices when you're out there oppressing the poor. That's all meaningless unless you're doing the right thing. That's even pretty clear within the Torah. Just as much as there's law around animal sacrifice, there's law about how to treat the stranger and the orphan and the poor and the widow, right? So some of that form, though, remained. Even though the prayer and sacrifice sort of started to separate from one another, some of that form remained. It was the content of it that was changed in terms of what sacrifice meant in ancient Israelite religion. The God of Israel didn't need anything from us in terms of sustenance, but required much of us in terms of requiring love and mercy and justice and righteousness. Just for a reference text to support this idea, check out text number 1 there. It's Micah chapter 6, verse 8. So Micah is one of the prophetic books. And here Micah says, God has told you, O human, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. And it's pretty simple. Only to do justice, love goodness, and walk modestly with your God. And you'll note pretty clearly there's no mention of sacrifice there. This is one of the prophets saying clearly, like, the most important thing is what you do, and the other stuff is secondary. God doesn't need your sacrifices. God will get along just fine. What God wants you to do is to do good and justice and walk modestly with God. The upshot of that is, this is something I think we kind of take for granted these days, but I'm trying to get you to appreciate how radical of an idea it was at the time. Anyone who followed these precepts could then come before God at any time and in any place and connect with words alone. To pull another text here from Hosea chapter 14, verse 3. Hosea again sort of ignores the idea of sacrifice and says instead, take words with you and return to the Lord. This is a setup by Israel has been doing the wrong thing. How are you supposed to go about getting right? Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to God, forgive all guilt and accept what is good. Instead of bulls, we will pay the offering of our lips. So nearly explicitly there, the prophet's saying the sacrifices aren't the key thing here. It's and there's a couple of key things here. The words and the idea of forgiveness and God's acceptance of prayer are both implicit here. Like you can read that in. It's a pretty radical departure from a lot of the rest of ancient Near Eastern religion that was really founded on this kind of quid pro quo, to use a term of the day, right? We do something for you and you do something for us. We sacrifice exactly the right thing and you make it right. That's not how the God of Israel works. The God of Israel is going to make it rain or do whatever because that's just what God does. And what's for us is to offer our words, and it's sort of what's in our hearts and the words that come out of our mouths that are really the important things. Okay, so perhaps as a result of this very liberating concept, the Bible is filled with personal prayer, which you may not really have noticed on any sort of initial read through, but when you go looking for the prayers, you'll find a lot of them. I pulled out a pretty salient example here of prayer that happens almost at whim. Like it's not tethered to any time of day or situation. People kind of spontaneously pray. So here in Numbers chapter 12, verses 10 to 13, the Israelites are in the wilderness, and Miriam, Moses and Aaron's sister, has been stricken with something called sarat, which we don't know exactly what it is. It's commonly mistranslated as leprosy. It's certainly not that, but it is some kind of scaly skin disease. And what happens is, as the cloud withdrew from the tent, that's the presence of God, there was Miriam, stricken with snow-white scales. When Aaron turned towards Miriam, he saw that she was stricken with scales. And Aaron said to Moses, "Oh, my Lord, account not to us the sin which we committed in our folly. Let her not be let her not be as one dead who emerges from their mother's womb with half their flesh eaten away." So Moses, what does he do? He prays. Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "El Narafan Allah, O God, please heal her." Right? So here we have a completely spontaneous expression of, I mean, it's a prayer expression, but it's a feeling of petition, requesting healing, but it's driven by this sense of urgency and need and pain and angst at his sister's predicament, right? There are many, many other examples. I pulled one here from the second chapter of Samuel, which is much longer. I just sort of left the beginning here, but this is Hannah's prayer. In chapter 1, she's kind of tormented by her sister wife Peninnah, who has children, but Hannah doesn't. And so she goes to the temple and she prays. And actually, initially, the priest Eli thinks she's drunk because she's sitting. It says she's sort of sitting there mumbling to herself. And he thinks she's drunk and it's like ready to kick her out. And she's like, no, I'm actually here because of the depth of my sorrow and my pain over this. And then it relates to us in the next chapter, the words that she prayed. This is actually, so she's praying, and this is her Thanksgiving prayer afterward. So she prays both to have a child, and then in chapter 2 here she expresses all this gratitude, these feelings of gratitude again in prayer, and it explicitly uses the word prayer here. So you can see all throughout the Bible, this has precedent. Right? But important things to note are the way prayer is not tethered to time in any way. The way prayer is spontaneous and not read from any sort of text, and the way it's driven by emotion. Okay. The Tanakh also contains more formal prayer that exists in ancient Israel. The Book of Psalms is basically it's a proto-Siddur in many ways, and a lot of those psalms did get included in the Siddur. But they were written by probably professional poets and musicians for a lot of different purposes, to express thanks, blessings, praise. Remember what the sacrifices were for? Thanks, blessings, praise. They were texts that were written for these purposes. And further, we know that the temple ritual was also, the sacrifice ritual was accompanied by this kind of poetry and music. We read that one of the jobs of the Levites was to kind of be the instrumentalist, to play, to lead everybody in song and to play music along with the sacrificial service. So it's really interesting to note, like we just talked about how prayer and sacrifice were divorced from one another, but they almost certainly coexisted at the same time. There was a coexistence of sacrifice in the temple and prayer, both outside of and within it. Independent prayer developed in ancient Israel as free expression of the individual, while more formal prayer existed within a framework of public worship. And that idea of sort of public prayer and public worship traces itself probably, and this is sort of scholarly consensus we're relying on here, the Babylonian exile, because the key moment is going to come later when the second temple is destroyed, and all of a sudden we don't have that kind of center of our religion anymore. But at that time, the Jewish people already had an experience of templelessness, right?
Yeah.
There was a first exile to Babylon, right? So, if this is not something you're already fully familiar with, and I don't expect that you would be, in 586 BCE or 587, depending on who you ask, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians, conquered the land of Israel and exiled many of the people to Babylon as part of their strategy for pacifying and controlling lands they conquered, was to ship a bunch of the locals away and replace them with foreigners who didn't know the land and would be much easier to control. So there was this big community, a big Jewish community living in Babylon and trying to figure out how to go about maintaining the religion in the absence of a temple. So we have the rise of what we know today as synagogues. A synagogue in Hebrew, anybody know synagogue in Hebrew? Beit Knesset. So Beit is a house, Knesset means gathering or assembly. So literally it has nothing to do with prayer on its face. It's a house of gathering, a house of assembly. And so these early synagogues arose as sort of meeting houses to gather and probably to learn, but also to pray. The centralization of sacrificial worship in Jerusalem had already happened. If you go and read other parts of the Bible, it's really concerned with where you could sacrifice or not. And there was some of the prophets like Elisha go about destroying altars in other places outside of Jerusalem, because that was seen as forbidden worship. So it had already kind of been centralized. The only authentic place to sacrifice is the temple, which obviously, can't do in Babylon. So that was already starting to drive the development of the synagogue. If we couldn't sacrifice, but we wanted to maintain contact with our God, what are we going to do? We're sort of forced to evolve the edifice of prayer. So they evolved modes and manners of public worship that really laid the groundwork for what we know today. After the return from exile, which actually an innovation brought along at that time, which we'll cover in a later class, was the institution of public reading of Torah, generally credited to guys like Ezra and Nehemiah, who led the people back. In the Second Temple periods, the temple's rebuilt, and once again, we sort of have the coexistence of sacrificial worship and prayer. So synagogues weren't just going to go away. It's hard to say exactly when, but a kind of liturgy was probably in place, at least in rabbinic circles, by roughly the last century BCE, or maybe first century CE, so roughly the time of Jesus of Nazareth, that kind of era. The idea of public prayer has evolved and sort of been codified to the point that there's kind of a known order, kind of a known liturgy. There is at least a way to pray that generally people are familiar with. And I should be more specific. Certainly this kind of elite rabbinic circles are familiar with, like the very learned folks. It seems unlikely that sort of the ordinary, probably illiterate folks would necessarily know that, because they don't hang out in those elite circles, and also nothing was written down. It was all oral. So we'll circle back to that in the next section on the Siddur. But so basically, already while the temple's still standing, there's something that starts. There's an institution that starts to resemble kind of prayer as we know it today, in something like a synagogue as we know it today. Now, of course, the big moment that really kind of launched us on the trajectory we've been on for the last 2,000 years was the destruction of the Second Temple. So that happened in the year 70. And it seems really like only natural at that point that synagogues, which already existed as these kind of diaspora institutions, would assume an even more important role, because again, a lot of the population goes into exile outside the land of Israel, joins communities that continued to exist outside the land of Israel from the previous exile, things like that. And similarly, prayer itself becomes more prominent. Already, a lot of Jews lived outside the land of Israel, and life away from the temple already had a sense of being normal and regular, and they had already figured out how to do that. Like, I think there's sort of a common misconception that this was a, really it was a cataclysmic moment, but cataclysmic in terms of what it did to Israelite religion. That's only partially true. They already knew how to pray in a lot of ways, and they knew how to exist without a temple, or at least far from it. It did sort of pull the basis out from under that. I think, even public prayer sort of worked under the assumption that someone else was doing the proper sacrifice somewhere, and that sort of fulfilled our obligation for us, so that we don't necessarily have to. So there was still something early to grapple with, and we'll see how the rabbis went about that. But the temple was service. The temple was avodah through sacrificial rites, whereas the synagogue was more what you might call avodat halev, the service of the heart. It was the sort of temple that's in here. Okay, so there's a lot I'm going to sort of step past this kind of important background information about how we got here. But I'm going to start talking about the rabbis as an institution without going too much into detail about how they became the rabbis. But the short version is that they're the educated elites who spend a great deal of time in study and in close community with one another. They assumed the position of sort of de facto leaders because they were the educated ones. And who were in a position to preserve tradition. So in the immediate post Second Temple period, you start to get this establishment by the rabbinic community of what we call matbeah, which is a fixed prayer order, a fixed pattern of prayer. Now, matbeah is actually the same word as a coin. So that sort of gives you a sense. It's like something printed, something stamped, something standardized, right? Like a coin. So matbeah is what we term the kind of the fixed order of things in prayer. Okay, so that meant not only starting to fix the words of prayer, but also the order that things went in, the times that prayer was conducted, the content, like I said. And there were two key developments that went along with that from the standpoint of rabbinic development of prayer as an institution. Okay, key development number one. The rabbis determined that the sort of spiritual successor to the fixed order and pattern of sacrifices in the temple would be a fixed order and pattern of prayers. So again, to reference Leviticus, Vayikra, there's clearly outlined, guidelines as far as, when such and such happens, you sacrifice this animal in this way with these other corresponding libations and all this kind of stuff. It's not quite a manual, but we're led to believe that such a thing did go on in the temple, and everyone knew, what the sacrifice would be on a given day and for what circumstances. This was all very tightly choreographed, right? So they determined that since we couldn't physically do that anymore, the sort of spiritual successor would be, we're going to do fixed prayer things at fixed times and corresponding the same times and dates. And already here we sort of have the birth of the Siddur, because how are you going to do and make sure that people are doing the same thing in the same way? You got to start to fix it, right? And you can hear in the word Siddur, the Hebrew root samach daled resh. It's the same root as Seder, like Passover Seder, which you probably have heard means order. And the key thing of the Passover Seder is that we do thing one, thing two, thing three, in order, right? Siddur is the same way. Like it's the ordering of prayer, right? That's key development number one. Sacrifices are going to become prayer in that way. Second key development, recitation of the order of prayer became not just a matter of choice and a spontaneous expression of your thanksgiving or your guilt or your repentance or whatever it was. It became a religious obligation. So, and again, corresponding to sacrifices, there were sacrifices that you sort of ordinary, you the ordinary Israelite could bring for various reasons. You had a great, harvest. Your child got married, whatever. You could bring a sacrifice of Thanksgiving, where you feel like you did the wrong thing. You could bring an I'm sorry kind of sacrifice. There were also obligatory ones. There was, every single day there would be morning, afternoon, evening, an extra one on Shabbat, extra ones on holidays. That was mandated. That was part of the religious practice. That was obligatory. So prayer now is going to sort of assume that role too, of being not just something you do when you feel like it, when you feel moved, but something that you're obligated to as part of your religious practice. This is hard to understate how radical that actually is. because the Torah doesn't say pray, the Torah says sacrifice. The rabbis made it as potent of a decree, as a command, as that kind of Torah. That was the only way to get people to follow it, basically. So they actually rooted that relatively radical legal ruling, interestingly enough, in the behavior of the patriarchs. It was really important to link that all the way back to the beginning, to link it to Torah. I think I pulled it. I did on the backside of your page. There's a bit of a lengthy quote from the Talmud. So this is in Brachot. This is the very first tractate of Talmud, and we may actually get to when we talk about the Shema and its blessings. I may pull the very first lines from the very first tractate of Talmud, which very interestingly starts with Shema and the question of when's the appropriate time to say Shema. So here we read in Brachot, and again, I sort of pulled a smaller passage here. It was stated, Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Chanina, said, the practice of praying 3 times daily is ancient, albeit not in its present form. Prayers were instituted by the patriarchs. However, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said that the prayers were instituted based on the daily offerings sacrificed in the Holy Temple, and the prayers parallel the offerings in terms of both time and characteristics. So they're already kind of holding both of these things. They know if we only say prayers are taking over for the temple, then it's sort of giving away the game that we're innovating. And it's really important to remain anchored in tradition, because otherwise it's inauthentic. If it doesn't go all the way back to Sinai or to Abraham and all the way back to the beginning, then it's somehow not authentic. And so they knew they couldn't just say prayers are taking over for sacrifice. So here's this voice saying that prayers were actually instituted by the patriarchs. Little did you know, right? So the Gemara comments, it was taught in a Baraita. Baraita is sort of an outside, it literally means an outside text, sort of like the director's cut, like it's some of the material that got left on the cutting room floor. It was taught in a Baraita. In according with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, son of Chanina, he's the guy that says patriarchs institute prayer. And it was taught in a Baraita according with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. So we have texts that support both of these things. They're saying both of these are true simultaneously. The Gemara elaborates. It was taught in a Baraita according with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Chanina. They're just reintroducing what they're going to say. Abraham instituted the morning prayer. As it stated, when Abraham came to look over Siddur, the day after he had prayed on its behalf, you recall Abraham sort of negotiated with God. They frame that as prayer on behalf of Siddur, saying, if there's 50, 40, 30 good people in Siddur, don't destroy it. It ends up not working, but still it says, Abraham rose early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And from the context, as well as the language utilized in the verse, the verb standing can mean nothing other than prayer, right? It's an interpretive leap, but they're saying standing equals prayer. Therefore, Abraham stood in the morning. Therefore, he instituted shacharit as we know it. He was the first one to daven shacharit. The rabbis had no historical scruples whatsoever. But the reality of this is entirely beside the point. Entirely beside the point. And to substantiate that, as this language, it's used elsewhere to describe Pinchas's prayer after the plague that swept through the Israelite camp. It stated Pinchas stood up and prayed, and the plague ended. So clearly, Abraham was accustomed to stand in prayer in the morning. And if we read on, we learn that, I'll give you one guess who the next patriarch is who invented Mincha? Isaac. Because it says one time Isaac went out into the field at around noontime. Going out in the field, lasuach basareh, can mean nothing other than going out to meditate in the field in the afternoon. Therefore, Isaac davened mincha for the first time. Mm-hmm. And Jacob, furthermore, there's something he does in the evening, and Jacob instituted Ma'ariv. So, yes, this sounds hilarious. It's totally anachronistic. And it's also crucial because for the rabbis, they were trying to maintain continuity, right? If they had just said, we're making this all up. We don't have a temple anymore. We're going to just totally change our whole method of worship. I think that would have been, framed by a lot of folks as kind of a betrayal, maybe. it wouldn't have the kind of compelling weight that this does. So they're really deliberately anchoring it in the mythic past. Okay. So there's two key developments, like I said, that fixed order of prayer that mimics the fixed order pattern in the temple, and the fact that it's now a religious obligation. Those two factors get superimposed on basically material that already existed. Because remember, people had been gathering to pray and composing liturgy, things like that. The actual content may go back before the formation of the Siddur. But they started to pull it together, because now, in order to make this something regular and formulaic, and it's something we're going to expect people to do, we have to show them how to do it. We have to be able to give them something to do it with. So, important note here. This is a bit of a side note commentary. These days, you can find a lot of different Siddurim, a lot of different prayer books, and different ones are more or less comfortable with making changes to things, either in the order or changing the order, changing prayers. It's important to note we're not actually fundamentally altering the nature of Jewish prayer when we do that. We're really just continuing a process that was started, millennia ago. Because at one point they were doing the same thing of shifting things around and putting things in places. Okay. I'm going to go on to the next section, the formulation of the Siddur, but I want to take a quick pause for questions. What questions do you have so far about transition from temple to tefillah?
Well, basically, they did a good job of it.
They did a good job of it? I'm glad you appreciate it.
Well, there have been any number of religions throughout history that were land-based.
Sure.
And when their government and their hierarchy of priests was destroyed, it totally vanished. The people didn't continue it.
I think that's absolutely true. It's a testament to their foresight, and their success. They're like, yeah, we're still here. Yeah. Despite being unanchored from the temple. You're absolutely right. Yeah. If there's folks, I see someone else on the as a participant on the street, but I can't tell who you are. So if you're able to sign into the chat there and chat something, you have a question, feel free to. Steffi, you have a question on your face?
Well, okay. I was trying to figure out now where do all the writings, the Torah itself, come in with that? Because there's like the Babylonian Torah.
Babylonian Talmud.
Talmud, okay.
Yeah.
And so recognizing the topic of the class is the Siddur.
Right. What's the relationship between those texts and the other texts that were?
I guess how. I want to ask. How does the Torah and the Talmud writings or development, how does that fit in with this?
That is a topic for a whole other course.
Yeah, I figured as much,
but on one foot. And actually, I think I'm going to teach next in the spring, basically an introduction to rabbinic texts. So not so much Torah and not so much Tanakh, but Mishnah, Gemara, Midrash. Yeah, Adrian's excited. I think it's another super important thing to understand. It was all basically going on contemporaneously. The Torah came together from a lot of different component parts, and there's a lot of different theories about how that happened. That's yet another course. But it was more or less codified by the time of the Babylonian exile. Like some of the later texts of the Tanakh are supposed to be exilic or post-exilic. Like it's clear that some of the prophets are talking about exile or talking to the Israelites who were in exile. So about that era. So it was more or less codified after that. The rabbinic writings of the Mishnah and the Gemara that came together to become the Talmud. That was pulled together probably a little bit after this process began, but still very contemporaneous. The Siddur was not like fully finished, and we'll get to that until many centuries later. Like printing press era.
Right,
yeah.
We'll get to that. So very much at the same time, and there would have been a lot of overlap between those processes.
And so basically it was the priests that were doing the writings, and it was all an intellectual kind of thing, pretty much. I mean, and educated and
writing is almost certainly. I mean, there's probably some, like the Psalms we have, obviously were written down at some point, but I think the vast majority would have been oral. And remember, like the key thing was the sort of spontaneity of it at one point. So there probably was not a lot that was not written down. That would have been probably in what would have been recognized as a familiar style, but would have been probably extemporaneous to some extent. It was probably partially priests, but probably others too. Like this is a lot in the ancient past, so much that like we don't really know where this stuff comes from. We're sort of describing the process more than the actual details of how it was all articulated. That makes sense.
but the source or the home for the collection of the writings, etc.
Yeah.
Were basically within the temple and then carried to Babylon?
No.
Okay.
They would have been almost entirely. So Torah written, yes. That was
Yeah.
there were different recensions of that text, but basically that was more or less fixed by the time of the destruction. All the other rabbinic stuff, all the commentary, all that kind of stuff, is entirely oral. That's why it's such a big deal in the 3rd century when they start writing it down.
Okay.
And that's the topic for the spring. Okay. Okay. So the next stage, we're getting into the formation of the Siddur, of the prayer book as we know it. So I should tell you too that a lot of my teaching for this class is drawn from a few books which we have on hand here. So if you were interested in pursuing your own study, I highly recommend Entering Jewish Prayer by Reuben Hammer. Yeah, that's a good one. A Guide to Jewish Prayer by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. Davening, A Guide to Meaningful Jewish Prayer by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. This is more of a, these are more like describing. This is more like how to do it, kind of like how to feel it. Also really great. And there's another book over on the shelf there called My People's Prayer Book, which is super useful and it's where I have the concept of rubrics at all. It's those colorful ones down there on the second shelf. I think volumes like 1 and maybe 5, and there's a 10th. There's like 3 volumes missing from the set. So if you're thinking about a donation to the Vietnam Library, there's a few missing volumes. Okay. So this element I took, I believe, from our friend Reuben Hammer, but he describes the Siddur as our encounter with 3,000 years of Jewish history, experienced from within. It's like a diary kept over all those centuries. It's a collection of prayers composed by generations before us who endeavored to express the meanings of their lives. He calls it the spiritual tell of the Jewish people. Do you know what a tell is? Oh, good, I get to try it. Okay.
Like a mound?
Yeah, exactly. So if you've ever been, if you've been to Israel, you've seen this phenomenon. So basically, what would happen is on a piece of ground there would be, they would build a city, right? And the city would be destroyed and conquered, and then they would build another city over it. And then that would be ground down, and they'd build another city over that, and another city over that. And eventually you'd end up with like cities built on hills that then would have, more stuff built over it. And you end up with these big mountains that are these archaeological wonders, because what you could do is dig straight down and get this cross section of just years, different eras of society in ancient Israel. It's called a tel, T-E-L. And so Reuben Hammer calls it the spiritual tell of the Jewish people because you can dig through it and see and get a sense of these different eras of development. So going back as much as we can to the way it all began, there's of course no official written record to consult here, but without any sort of official written out matbeya yet. There couldn't be any mistakes in prayer. If there was no thing you were supposed to do, all prayer was authentic, right? There could be no deviation from a single proper text if there was no single proper text. So what it probably looked like, and again, we don't have any sort of official sources here, every synagogue would have probably had their own prayer practice, which is kind of like we are today, but even more variety. Every shaliach tzibur, every leader of every prayer leader would have had their own version of the text, as it were. If they were part of that rabbinic community, they might have, sort of what was the latest and greatest within that oral tradition, but it would still be their version that they had heard from their teacher, so it was all in people's heads, basically. And every service may well have featured innovative language, either on purpose or by accident, if, the prayer leader just forgot what they had done yesterday, or if they deliberately decided to improvise and change something from the way they usually did it as a way to make a particular point. A really useful metaphor that makes sense to me because I grew up doing this, but I'm going to attempt to deploy here is prayer as jazz. Yeah, you know a little bit on one time. So great jazz players never play the same thing the same way twice, even though you can always recognize what song they're playing, right? Because they're always doing it they're playing slightly different notes. That keeps it interesting and fresh. But there's never any doubt about what the song is because they're staying close to an established form that you recognize as that song. If they were to get too far away from it, it sort of loses coherence, right? So in prayer, the rabbis called this kind of improvisation around a theme. They call that kavanah. Literally means intention, and it's something more like the inner directedness of the heart. And the rabbis understood kavanah to be crucial. What was at stake wasn't just saying the right blessing, as it were, but actually saying it the right way. That was the really important thing at the outset. But improvisation in jazz depends on having a melody line to improvise on. So there has to be a norm against to measure against in order to experience those kind of creative deviations. So there has to be something that's fixed. And when we talk about prayer, we call this keva. Keva means fixity, predictability, order, something like that. I'll put those terms up. I'll spell them out up here. So there's keva, kavanah. Okay. So the keva is what's fixed and stable, and the kavanah is that inner directedness of the heart. And proper prayer sort of necessarily has to combine both. Once we've decided that there needs to be some sort of formulaic way you do it, you need some keva. But if that's all you do, then we know that doesn't work because that's not how our ancestors did it. And we already learned that God doesn't just want us to do the right things. God's not sustained by our saying the words. We have to mean it. We have to feel it, right? So there's got to be kavanah too. The core, the sort of, like, I like to think of this process as sort of the way the solar system formed. First, the matter sort of gathered to become the sun, and once there was that mass at the center, things started you could orbit around that. So the sort of core at the center of the prayer solar system is what we know today as the Amidah. Amidah means standing. And it was actually originally known, and if you see it referenced in rabbinic literature, it's called Hatfilah. It literally means the prayer. Because at one time it was the prayer, as in like the only prayer. Which really conveys its central importance, right? And there are passages in Talmud that purport to describe its institution. There's at least two key ones. I didn't pull them because that's sort of a sidetrack. But it's also probably not the whole story. That's the kind of the rabbi's interpreted version of history. We'll do more on the Amidah and how it came together, both from the rabbinic perspective and the more objective historical perspective, in about 2 weeks. The other big one, like after there was the sort of sun, I guess, at the center, that is the Amidah, the sort of first big planet to start to come into this, that That orbit was the Shema, which should be pretty familiar to anyone who's attended a Jewish service before. It was understood to be mandated by Torah, in fact. That line, when you lie down and when you rise up. We'll note later on the Shema becomes, it's part of the morning service, part of the evening service. No need to say it in the afternoon, because it's when you lie down and when you rise up, right? So that sort of gives you an idea of the very core. We're going to go into a little more detail of it when we talk about Siddur and prayer rubrics. So basically, two kind of main components. Amidah, Shema become the kind of basis around which things start to kind of accrete, kind of glom onto. And there's this, and this sort of speaks to a little bit what you were getting at, a transition from orality, where everything is just passed down orally from one another, to poetry and to writing things down to transmit. Okay, so rabbinic legal discourse that was flourishing in the first few centuries came to be collected in an easy date to remember. I like 222 CE. Almost certainly not the actual year it happened, but it's roughly accurate and easy to remember. 222 CE is the codification of the Mishnah. Okay. So about that era, and then roughly 300-ish years after that, depending on who you ask, the Gemara, and that's brought together in the Talmud. You don't have to worry about that. Okay. So just to know that was all going on in these first centuries post-temple. So while they were doing that, they elaborated this growing body of details regarding proper prayer, because it's part of, like, it's a religious obligation. So they explicated it. They're like, okay, well, how do we do it in the best, most authentic way possible? And so they did a lot of thinking and then talking to one another and then writing down, oh, how do you pray properly? Combining both keva and kavanah. So some examples of this is sort of codification of what we now know as the blessing formula. How does every blessing start? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, right? Every blessing. So that was a rabbinic innovation. They figured out, they sort of reasoned out the way to bless best and most properly that will achieve our kavanah of intending to praise God for something, but also have enough of a keva, enough fixity that it's portable and transportable, will be to start every blessing the same way. And it's only the end part that changes depending on context, right? Okay, great. So that's one element. Another good example is what about after you bless? What do I do? When to say Amen? Because they decide that since this is a religious obligation, like a lot of mitzvot, someone else can fulfill it on my behalf. So you get the phenomenon of a prayer leader praying and everyone else saying Amen, and it's as if they have said it themselves. Consequently, when do you say Amen? Only after hearing someone else say a blessing. Not it wouldn't make any sense for me to say Amen to my own blessing. And the rabbinic legal discourse about proper prayer, that's one element, right? Say Amen after someone else's blessing. So that's what I'm getting at, is there's this sort of growing body of details about how to pray properly. And when it was just a small group of elite rabbis, they were perfectly capable of improvising prayers for each other while remaining proper, within close to the form. You can imagine, a jazz band that plays together all the time. They know the sort of familiar melodies and things like that. But if one of those players was to go sit in with a different group, they're going to have no idea what's going on, and that's going to fall apart. And so increasing time after the disruption and increasing distance between communities made that unsustainable. Like, communities were going to get too far out on their own. So, but there's also desire to hold on to the keva and express creativity through kavanah. So people basically started composing their own prayers. And sometimes they caught on because there was both needed literary outlet, and also there were some really good prayer writers back then. There were some, like in any generation, there were some really good poets. So people started composing their own prayers. Sometimes they caught on. So there's this sort of accretion of other material around Shema and Amidah. A form in particular called a piyutz, it's a liturgical poem. If you go and look in the Siddur, for example, I'm drawing a blank. I think it's El Adon in the Shabbat morning service. You'll notice it's an alphabetic acrostic. Each line starts with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. A very common form for a liturgical poem. I don't know why they thought that was so clever. Everyone did it, but they did it. And so like that's one form that people would use. You see it in the high holiday liturgy all over the place, right? So basically what we know today is the liturgy. It came about this way. It was first kind of these ad hoc oral improvisations around the structural core. And then, that was done by the rabbinic elite. And then there was this growing regulation and standardization. And then there was poetry created by poets who adapted the artistic norms around them. They definitely wrote in the style that was sort of popular. Like, they would, you could tell when they were mimicking, local Islamic forms or whatever, things like that. So they sort of adapted their artistic norms to Jewish practice. And many, many centuries pass. These impulses lead to more codification, early versions of the Siddur. Rav Avram Gaon, and I think maybe the 9th century or so, is one of the first to sort of codify a Siddur himself, like really write it down and place it all in one place. But it's not until like invention of the printing press that we get mass distribution of like one standardized Bea. But it's all sort of heading that way, if that makes sense. I'm alighting a lot of this process. A lot of it is speculative, but also not necessarily relevant. The point is core to which stuff got started being attached. I'm gonna make one more transition into, and we're already coming up on an hour here, so we'll wrap up relatively quickly. I'm gonna make another transition to a section about how we're gonna analyze the Siddur according to these rubrics, but I wanna pause here for questions about formation of the Siddur and how that went about. What questions do you have?
So the finalization basically took place, I'm assuming, in Jerusalem?
No, probably in Babylon. There was a very small Jewish community living after the destruction of the temple by the Romans. There was still a Jewish community there, but very small. There was enough of a community to write their own Talmud, but it gradually lost its importance relative to the academies of Babylon.
Okay.
So a lot of it would have happened there.
Before the return from exile.
Oh, this is way after exile. We're talking like first 8 or 9 centuries CE.
Okay, so
and very much
a lot of so a large group stayed then in Babylon.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you're talking from the original exile?
Yeah.
Probably some. There was probably like when the Romans destroyed the temple in 70. There was almost certainly a community in Babylon left over from the original exile.
Okay.
But they were dramatically reinforced, and there was already sort of people going back and forth between those places. It was already like a community.
So Babylon
center
was kind of a second center of learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Once the Romans, the destruction, etc., then Babylon became.
Yeah, it was New York City, biggest concentration of Jews outside of the land of Israel.
Okay. Okay. And that's where then in all of this they codified.
Yes, but like remember individual synagogues and there are other diaspora communities in Egypt,
Right.
Things like that. They would have been doing their own Siddur development and the same process there.
Okay.
Some intercourse back and forth as people travel and maybe bring what's new and cool in Babylon to Alexandria or whatever. But also doing their own thing. Like they didn't have the internet to connect everyone, get everyone on the same page, right? So that's why this is a centuries process that unfolded for centuries. Yeah.
So,
but it's driven by these things of Keva, wanting to preserve Keva and Kavanah, sort of drives towards for like codification, standardization, frequently at the expense of Keva, but that's why, like, correspondingly, it's important to come up with ways to inject that back in. If that makes sense.
Okay. But if Egypt had its
Right.
thing and Babylon had its thing and whatever other center had its thing, how did it eventually get codified into what?
That's a much longer and obscure process that I'm sure there are literary historians who have that kind of answer to. It's not the level of detail that these books go into because it's not really necessary. Like once you understand the process, the results is kind of what's important. But probably the same thing, like bringing Siddurs from back and forth, and it wasn't ever 100%, codified. There are still different nusachs, different traditions. The Sephardim have theirs. There's Edom and Mizrach, the sort of Middle Eastern Jews have theirs. Things like that. So like there's still ethnic distinctions.
Okay.
So onward. Okay. So how are we going to go about analyzing the Siddur? Now that you know a bit like how it got there, you can understand that it was put together with some deliberateness. It's not just this sort of random accumulation of like, oh, here's a cool biblical text. Here's another cool one. Here's this thing somebody wrote. Like it looks that way if you just read it straight through. But what we're going to do is analyze it and sort of show how it came together in a deliberate way and the structure to it. So rather than kind of granular dissection of liturgy by words or phrases, our goal is going to be to comprehend the structures of the prayer service, their function, their elements, and their variations across the different times and days, because that's how you're going to know what's different about Shabbat that makes the Shabbat prayer special, is how it's different from the weekday, right? Okay, so I'm going to do a little diagramming to give you an idea of what's coming. So you're probably familiar already with that there are three daily services. Shachrit in the morning, Mincha in the afternoon, and Ma'ariv in the evening. I'm going to talk about Shachrit first because it's the most complete. It's the morning. If you're going to learn one, learn that one because then it'll help you understand the rest. It's sort of the baseline, the morning one. Next 3 sessions will all be focused on elements from Shachrit. And we'll move on to Mincha and Ma'ariv as a separate thing, because once you understand Shachrit, Mincha and Ma'ariv are really easy. So Shachrit it's the most complete. It's composed of 7 consecutive units that each build on one another to create this definitive pattern. And it's been passed down to us with a deliberate shape and design. So I'm going to sort of sketch it out, and my placement, my sort of physical placement, is also deliberate. So the first thing you do when you come to prayer in the morning is called Birkot HaShachar. Those are the morning blessings. They celebrate the new day. They emphasize the study of sacred texts. There's expressions of gratitude, thankfulness for just being alive, being able to get up and pray in the morning. Move from there into what's called Psukei de Zimra. Which are verses of song. And Psukei is designed to lift our mood, to create a sense of community through coming together in communal singing. Like I said, sort of at the beginning, create the sense of exuberance, excited expectation, something like that. It's a lot of psalms, it's a lot of praise, and the Zimra part is deliberate. It's almost certainly designed to be sung. There's a transition from there into Shema and its blessings. Which is something like, and I say this occasionally, it's something like a creed. Listen, Israel, our God God is our God, and our God is one. It's in a lot of ways the core of the liturgy. This unit has the official call to prayer, Baruch Hu. If this is all the warm up up to this level, that's our official call to prayer. It's a recital of Jewish belief in one God. It's affirmation of that belief by pulling key biblical texts. And we'll talk more, I think next section is all about Shema and its blessings, breaking that unit down specifically. After that is Amidah, which as we talked about is that central standing prayer, and it's composed of petitions, asking for things, asking for peace and health and prosperity and all the things of that nature. We'll talk in 2 weeks about the Amidah and how it breaks down into its component parts. A somewhat often overlooked part, a silent prayer. Oops, silent. Which was later expanded in what's known as Tachanun. This is a part that's frequently elided in basically all Reform communities. It's even skipped over a lot of conservative ones. We don't really do it here very much. I think even on Wednesday mornings. But basically, it's a chance to speak privately to God. It's sort of rolled these days into the silent part of the Amidah. It was originally kind of a daily confession, and now it's kind of a set of personal supplications. We might touch on it briefly, but because we don't do it, I'm going to kind of overlook that. Building yet further to Torah. Read on select days of the week, Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbats and holidays. We generally don't gather for prayer here on Mondays and Thursdays, but if we did, there would be as part of the weekday service, there would be a Torah reading, much shorter compared to Shabbat, no haftarah. That actually corresponds to, in the ancient world, Mondays and Thursdays were market days. So that's when everyone came into town to go to the market. That's when they started reading Torah out loud. It actually makes a lot of sense. And then on Shabbat, of course, when everyone gathered for prayer. Public reading of the sacred text. And then finally, conclusion, which contains a number of elements, most notably Aleinu and Kaddish. There are other prayers eventually added too. Those are kind of some of the main ones. Yes. So I sketched this outline out on purpose because it really is, I think, an ascent in that way. You're welcome to take a picture. I can also send you, I copied a diagram out of the book as well. I can send that to you, but you're more than welcome to take pictures. It's a process of building up to Torah, that's sort of almost recalling the revelatory moment at Sinai. And then sort of deliberate descent back down. But sort of, I think it's important to note the delta here, in between here and there. Like, the point is to uplift. The point is to walk out of there feeling empowered, emboldened, something like that. Like, if it brought you all the way back down, I think it would defeat its purpose in some way. Good, so that gives you a sense of the 7 units of the Shacharit service. Mincha in the afternoon and Mariv in the evening have only 4 of these elements, mostly drawn from these 7. We'll cover that in session 5. On Shabbats and holidays, which we're going to cover in the final 2 sessions, 6 and 7, this basic structure expands to admit special material that's relevant to that day, if it's stuff specifically for Shabbat or specifically for Sukkot or whatever it is. And also contracts in some ways to omit parts that aren't appropriate for the occasion. So Tachanun, that's really like, I'm inadequate, I'm humble, I'm suffering, omitted on basically every holiday, because that doesn't fit with the purpose, right? A lot of examples of that as well. But on the other hand, and then like in the Amidah and Shabbat, there's a sense that Shabbat ought to be a taste of perfection, a time when we should stop trying to force it and ask for things. So we don't do petitionary prayers. The Amidah is shortened instead of the usual 18 or 19, depending on how you count. Blessing. We do something more like 7 that omits some of those petitionary prayers. But there's also an entire service added, the Musaf, which corresponds to the additional sacrificial offering in there. So this is all stuff we'll get to a little bit later on. This basic structure still remains intact kind of throughout. And I think, understanding this intrinsic shape is really crucial for appreciating the genius behind the liturgy's design. When the Siddur deviates from this norm, as it were, that's where you get to experience Jewish creativity. So that brings me to the end of today's session. I think we're well set up for the future. What final questions do you have about prayer structure? What's upcoming? What questions do you have? Making sense? You seem excited? This helping things make sense already? Good, I'm really glad to hear it. Thank you all so much for coming. You're welcome to stay and chat. Thank you to anyone who is currently watching or plans to watch this on the recording in the future. I will make sure to share streaming links as far in advance as I can. I'm sorry about any confusion. This time I couldn't access the chats. It said I wasn't connected to the chat, so I shut it down, and that meant I had to reset it up with a new stream link. Hopefully that won't happen in the future, but I hope you're able to find it, and I will make sure to post recordings online for you folks to review if you want. Anyone else who wants to see this, hope you enjoy learning. Thanks, everyone.